This afternoon for our second Italian research seminar. And my name is Charles Levin. I'm an associate director of the Center for Italian Studies, so I wanted to welcome you all to this evening's lecture, which I wanted to say is co-sponsored by the Department of Africana Studies, the Department of Film, Television, and Theater, and the Department of History. So I wanted to thank all of those departments for helping to make this event possible. And I wanted to point out, I think, that there's something pretty special about a lecture from the Center for Italian Studies that could have that kind of range of co-sponsors. And I think it speaks to the mission of our center, which is intended to bring together scholars from across the disciplines who are drawn together, who share together an interest in Italy broadly conceived. And so we can have people who work in as we currently do in the Center for Italian Studies, we work in American studies, anthropology, art history and design, classics, English, French, German, film, television, and theater, history in the law school, and liberal studies, and philosophy, and theology, in addition to those of us who are in the Department of Romance languages and literatures. And it's that kind of broad sense of Italian studies that I think makes a lecture like this evening's such a fitting one for our center, because I think Jessica Harris, who's our speaker this evening, kind of embodies that interdisciplinary sense of Italian studies, not least because she's in the Department of History. She has a BA, MA, and PhD in history from UCLA, and an MA in Afro-American studies from UCLA. But she works on Italian film and media studies, among other things, in ways that I think would be just as at home in a department of Romance and languages and literatures like ours, or in a department of film, theater, and television, in addition to a department of history. And I think that speaks to the range of Jessica's work and what makes it, I think, so interesting and so vital. So she's the author, Jessica Harris, of Italian Women's Experiences with American Consumer Culture, 1945 to 1975, The Italian Mrs. Consumer, which was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2020, which is a study that looks at the arrival of American consumer culture in postwar Italy and how it challenged notions regarding women's roles and identities, and had an important function in encouraging sociocultural as well as economic changes in Italy. And Jessica is also a scholar of African American history, of 20th century US and the world, Black Europe, women's history, and modern Italy, with a particular interest in gender and race, their intersection with material culture, and the subsequent effect on group identities. And her current book project is a transnational cultural history on race and gender relations in Italy and the United States. Placing women at the center of analysis, the book employs the methodological approaches of critical race studies, cultural studies, gender studies, and post-colonial studies to examine the presence of African-American women in 20th century Italian television, film, music, and fashion. And Jessica's talk this evening is entitled Permettereste a vostro figlio di sposare Lola, Latent Fascism, American Culture, and Blackness in Postwar Italy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jessica Harris.
Thank you, Charles, for that very lovely and very kind introduction. Before I begin, I want to thank the University of Notre Dame for having me, as well as the Italian Research Seminar for inviting me to share some of my research with you all this evening. So, as Charles mentioned, the title of my talk is Permettereste vostro figlio di sposare Lola. Would you allow your son to marry Lola? Latent Fascism, American Culture, and Blackness in Postwar Italy. So in tonight's presentation, I will look at the intersection of fascist racist ideology in the post-war period in Italy, specifically looking at the figure of Lola Falana, who was an African-American singer, dancer, and actress who was quite popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in the US, and looking at how her being an American intersects with that latent fascism in Italian culture. Okay. So to begin, the end of the Second World War in 1945 marked a new beginning for Italy and was a key moment in the country's history as its leaders sought to rebuild the country, both physically and morally. First, the wartime destruction present throughout the peninsula's landscape was a glaring example of the need to move forward and into the modernity that was quickly traveling across the Atlantic from the shores of the US, the new post-war superpower. In 1958, just slightly over a decade after the end of the war, Italy entered its so-called economic miracle as it transformed from a primarily agricultural-based country, physically devastated from wartime battles, into a modern, industrialized one. Second, Italy's relatively recently collapsed fascist regime and its totalitarian policies represented another crucial aspect in its political and moral forms that needed to be transformed. In regard to the political aspect, on June 2nd, 1946, Italians voted for the country to become a democratic republic, a striking divergence from the one-party state Italians had lived in since 1926. Morally, fascist ideology and policies regarding race, such as the 1938 racial laws, which stripped the peninsula's Jewish population of numerous rights and freedoms, and the regime's practices of segregation in the capital cities of Italian East Africa, were examples of the moral path to not follow in constructing the new Italian Republic. In this regard, Article 3, which articulated a position on the topic of race and inclusion that stood in stark contrast to the racist and xenophobic discourses of the fascist period, was included in the Constitution. As Article 3 states, tutti I cittadini hanno pari dignità sociale e sono uguali davanti alla legge, senza distinzione di sesso, di razza, di lingua, di religione, di opinioni politiche, di condizioni personali and sociali. And the important here, in regard to my talk, is equal without distinction of race. As Valeria de Plano writes, this article, quote, officially rejected any racist ideology or discrimination based on sex, religion, or indeed race, and was meant to herald a new definition of the concept of Italianness with a more inclusive view of national belonging, unquote. As such, the Constitution's authors set forth a new moral path for Italians. Now, despite the desire to turn away from the country's totalitarian past, much of fascism remained a part of post-war Italian society. While fascist remnants were more apparent and visible in their physical aspects, such as the numerous monuments that had been constructed, one could also find the regime's ideological remains in cultural productions in the decades following the war's end. During Mussolini's rule, film and other visual media served the important function of articulating fascist ideas and spreading them to the masses. And in the decades following the war, film and other visual media again became vehicles for subtly disseminating fascist racist norms and ideas to Italians, thereby keeping this ideology in circulation long after the regime's end. And this was particularly true for how Italian cinema represented Black women and female Blackness during this period. Now, one important thing to note about these representations, as Gaia Giuliani has noted in her analysis of the period's visual culture, in particular Italian films, docufiction that were about colonization and decolonization, and representations of race and Blackness, is that rather than providing a, quote, simple replica of colonial stereotypes and discourses on race and gender, the media, quote unquote, rearticulated and, quote, locally contextualized, unquote, them for a post-fascist Italian audience. Therefore, rather than reflecting Article 3's tone of belonging, inclusion, and equality, films often tended to depict female Blackness and Black women as another, an entity outside the boundaries of national belonging and the idealized homogeneous white Italian community. Specifically, fascist colonial segregation policies and the denigration, sexualization, and exoticization of African women by Italian cultural products and Italians themselves that were begun in the liberal era and continued under Mussolini's dictatorship found their place in films featuring Black women during this time. In so doing, films such as La Notte, of which there's the screenshot of that, and Il Corpo reflected what Sandra Ponzanesi has termed Italy's quote-unquote colonial unconscious, the quote discarding, discrediting, and generally repressing of the history of colonial expansion, unquote, which allowed the country's moral rebirth to be arrested. The Italian career of African-American singer, dancer, and actress Lola Falana provides us with another example of the resurfacing of fascist, racist rhetoric in Italian media in the 60s and 70s. In the films in which she starred, as well as the press reporting on her career in the peninsula and life in general, the sexualized and racialized discourse found prominently in writings, postcards, and songs, among other Italian colonial cultural items from the 30s and 40s, were ever present. However, Falana's national origin and Americanness allowed for her to enjoy a status in Italian film and television and in the press above that of an object to be gazed at, a role that most Black women in Italian productions at the time were assigned. A prominent example of this is that of Zaudi Araya, the Eritrean top model who starred in Luigi Scattini's erotic film trilogy of La ragazza dalla pelle di luna, La ragazza fuori strada, and Il corpo. So the ongoing Cold War, America's positioning as a superpower, and the strong attraction of American culture in Italy gave Falana a certain cultural capital, which was then translated into social capital in the peninsula. And because of this, she had starring roles in which she was a subject rather than object, thus placing her on higher ground than most of her Black female counterparts, especially those from Africa, like Araya, them being from a continent that had been the victim of Europe's imperial desires. Therefore, in this context, the US had capital, something to offer other countries that were viewed as ripe for the taking, whereas Africa, with its historical colonized status, was seen as containing land and bodies to be exploited. These two seemingly divergent yet corresponding aspects that characterize Falana's Italian career, latent fascism and American cultural imperialism and capital, illustrate the fact that female Blackness was understood in multiple ways in Italian society. And those understandings pivoted along the axis of national origin. In this way, Falana serves as an important symbol of the intricacies and nuances of understandings of race among Italians at the time. And yet, despite this differentiation between female American Blackness and female African Blackness, any Blackness was still viewed outside the parameters of Italianness and Italian national belonging. As such, fascist racist ideology continued to influence Republican Italy despite the constitutional author's intentions to inaugurate a new racial legacy for the country. So just for a bit of historical context, Blackness from the liberal era to the post-war period in Italy. So Italian colonialism, dating back to the late 19th century, was based on decades of violent and unequal power relations between the indigenous population in Italy's colonies and the Italian settlers, in which the former was seen as inferior, uncivilized, and exploitable by the latter. For example, racial zoning, which separated Europeans from Africans and reinforced ideas of white superiority, was introduced in Asmara Eritrea in 1908. Furthermore, as noted by Giulia Barrera, denying Eritreans an education equal to that of Italians in the colony was another method used to marginalize and strip power from the indigenous population. And it was in the fascist era when Italy established its own African empire, Italian East Africa, as I mentioned, meant to be on par with other European nations' colonial holdings on the continent. And following this establishment, the fascist regime enacted a series of laws in the colonies that were meant to reinforce and solidify racial hierarchies that had been in place since the liberal era. And these laws sought to uphold the quote-unquote Italian racial prestige and to delineate the boundaries of Italian identity and belonging, using the protection and elevation of whiteness as their guiding principle. The first colonial racial law, passed in 1937, criminalized conjugal relations between Italians and Africans, calling for up to 5 years in prison for those that violated it. Another law passed in 1940, this time targeting the children of Italian-African relationships, reversed the precedent of these children being able to become Italian citizens. With the new law in place, these, as they were called then, mixed-race children were classified as colonial subjects, and Italian parents were forbidden from recognizing them or providing for them. In addition to racial laws instituting the physical separation of Italians and Africans and white Italian superiority, visual material, photos, postcards, films from this time period also worked towards the same end. Given that this material circulated between the colonies and the metropole, ideas promoting racial hierarchies in the colonies reached Italians in the peninsula, thus influencing their perceptions of Blackness. Illustrated postcards or actual photos of bare-chested African women had two effects. First, they served to sexualize and objectify the women. Second, they also instilled the notion of white Italian male superiority in both the creators of these products and those who received them. As such, these cultural products contributed to reifying notions of control, subjugation, and Italian superiority, and African inferiority among Italians. During the fascist era, Italian understandings of Blackness were also influenced by Italian cultural products featuring African Americans. The film Harlem, released in 1943 and directed by Carmine Gallone, negatively portrayed African Americans to illustrate Italian superiority over the indigenous population in its colonies, as well as fascist disapproval of African Americans' protest against Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. The end of fascism, the loss of Italy's colonial possessions, and the creation of the Italian Republic represented a partial shift in cultural depictions of Blackness. On one hand, neorealist films from the mid to late 1940s, such as Paisa and Senza Pietà, shined a more sympathetic light on African Americans. On the other hand, racist stereotypes and an exclusionary discourse continued to permeate these films. For example, the late 1940s film, Il Mulatto, directed by Francesco De Robertis, presented Italian audiences with a dual representation of Blackness. While it elicited sympathy for the film's young protagonist, Angelo, who you see there in the arms of the older man on the screen, Angelo, the child of an African-American soldier and white Italian woman, both of whom were no longer alive, it nonetheless relied on the long-standing stereotype of the violent black male rapist to explain how Angelo came to be. Moreover, the film's ending, which has Angelo go to live in the States with his African-American uncle, illustrates the fact that despite the Republic's desire for inclusion and equality, there was no place for Angelo and other mixed-race children in post-war Italy. In so doing, Il Mulatto continued to give life and credence to the fascist-era abhorrence of interracial sexual relations and the children they produced, as it was feared that they would, quote-unquote, contaminate the pure white Italian race, to use the terminology from the time. As a result, the film served to reinforce the strict racial parameters of Italian national belonging, thereby excluding real-life Angelos who did not fall within those boundaries. Therefore, fascist-era racist stereotypes and racial hierarchies, whose lineage could be traced back to the liberal era and its colonial endeavors, were still present in the immediate post-war period, despite the country's desire to construct a new moral standard. And this racialized construction of the nation-state that excluded Blackness continued to exist in the late 60s and 70s Italian culture. So now for some examples of this by looking at the career of Lola Falana, her career in Italy. So her Italian career first began in 1967 with her appearing in 3 films, Quando dico che ti amo, Lola Colt Faccia a Faccia con il Diablo, and Stasera mi butto, and co-starring in Rai's 10-episode-long variety program, Sabato Sera, which was hosted by Mina and directed by Antonello Falqui. Now, at the time of Falana's arrival in Italy, she was an up-and-coming star in the United States. She had been mentored by Sammy Davis Jr. She had appeared on Broadway and also in film. So Falana starred in these 3 films in '67 in the television show, went back to the States. 1971, she comes back to Italy. She appears in Teatro 10. 2 years later, in 1973, she co-hosts another Rai variety show, I Visto Mai, with Gino Bramieri. And then she doesn't come back to Italian television until 1982, when she appears in the Fininvest program, Made in Italy. So returning to Falana's Italian arrival in 1967, taking into consideration her status as a rising star in the States, yet the persistence of a racialized discourse in 1960s Italy, the question to ask is, how would the singer, dancer, and actress be depicted in Italian film, television, and print media? Well, her films and writing on her in the print media provide some answers to that question. So first, taking a look at the film Stasera mi butto, which was directed by Ettore Maria Fizzarotti. The film is set in the summer months at a beach resort and follows the love story between Marisa, that's played by Marisa Sania, who's been held back a year, and the young, awkward professor, Carlo, played by Giancarlo Giannini. And he's been hired by Marisa's father, the beach club owner, to tutor her. The film is a musicarello, which was a genre from 1958 to 71, targeted towards youth audiences, featured numerous musical numbers, and served to promote the talents of various young Italian pop stars, such as Rita Pavone and Adriana Celentano. Now, in the case of Stasera mi butto, the main musical stars are Rocky Roberts, who you see there in the center of the poster in the orangish colored suit, and Lola Falana, and they both appear as themselves in the film. Because of this, they are given what I like to call a privileged or subject status, in that they're both recognized as being celebrities and appreciated for their musical and artistic talents by the teenagers in the film. This recognition of Roberts and Falana is an example of American cultural capital in Italy and its effect on the Italian cultural landscape. For example, Silvano Patriarca notes that during this time, quote, "La scena musicale e dello spettacolo italiano si distingue sempre più per la presenza di artisti neri nel contesto della loro passione per la musica rock. I giovani italiani prestarono crescente attenzione alla cultura e alla musica afroamericana." And this was also demonstrated in the press, the music magazines that featured increased articles on Black American musicians. So this presence of Black American musicians in print, according to Patriarca, was reflective of the rise of a quote-unquote sensibilità antirazzista, anti-racist sensibility in the peninsula that was connected to intellectuals and radicalized students' interest in the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s, as well as their interest in anti-colonialism. Therefore, the increasing appearance of African-American musicians, both on screen and in print, was a significant indicator of changing Italian attitudes in regard to race. However, as Patriarca also notes, and as will be demonstrated, these attitudes were not changed completely. Now, unlike Roberts, who primarily appears on screen when he's singing and dancing, Falana is given a role more central to the film's plot. She's not solely the dancing and singing Black body, as is Roberts, but she has significant speaking lines and plays the important part of helping Carlo win over Marisa. And you see Falana there with Carlo, and then Carlo and Marisa on the right. Whereas Roberts and Falana are appreciated by the youth in the film, they are not appreciated by the adults, however. During one of Roberts' performances, an older woman makes the following comment with a look of disdain on her face. Quote, "Questo urlo mi ricorda nel viaggio in Africa con il mio povero Filippo. Mi sembra di trovarmi tra I selvaggi." Her friend, who appears to be of the same age, replies, "Sì, hai ragione. Perché strillano tanto, dico io." This instance is a rare direct confrontation with Blackness offered by the film, using the generational divide between the adults and teenagers to illustrate the backwards and racist thinking of the older women. While the generational gap provides the reason for this explicit racist reaction, other scenes in the film that subtly re-employ fascist and colonial racist stereotypes and a racialized discourse include resort attendees of all ages. As such, all Italians are involved in and present for this implementation of the discriminatory and exclusionary aspects from the fascist period. So despite the prominent role and subjectivity given to Falana in Stasera mi butto, she's still depicted in ways that draw on colonial era stereotypes, thereby introducing these negative representations into the post-war cultural landscape. The first instance of this resurfacing is the title sequence of the film. Falana's is the first name to appear on screen, but underneath her name is, as you see there, and I'll say the current version, La Venera Nera. Okay? So the Black Venus was an image that represented the exotic sexual appeal of the Black female, but also the danger she presented to the white male. And this figure dates back to the illustrated pamphlets of the 1880s that featured Black women in nude or semi-nude photos and drawings that, as Rosetta Giuliani Caponetto notes, quote, depicted the swath of Africa that had been explored by Italians, unquote. In depicting African women as the Black Venus, white colonialists were not only defining the women as exotic, inferior, and sexual objects, but they were also reaffirming their superiority over the women. Hence, it was through the circulation of this visual material of Italy's quote-unquote conquests that the idea of the Black Venus as a consumable, sexualized, and racialized other became reified in the Italian imagination. Now, the presence of the Black Venus discourse here in Stasera mi butto recalls the debasement and exploitation of Saartjie Baartman, the Khoisan woman who, due to what was perceived as her abnormal and hence deviant large buttocks, was nicknamed the Hottentot Venus and put on display for white audiences in exhibitions in France and England in the early 19th century. In Italy, according to Barbara Sorgoni, Baartman was a source of public fascination for much of the 1800s. However, this fascination was practically extinguished by the end of the century in contrast to the rest of the West, where she remained a constant presence in cultural productions into the 20th century. It wasn't until the fascist period when Baartman reappeared in Italian public discourse. In the August 5th, 1938 issue of La Difesa della Razza, the magazine which articulated the regime's racial policies, of which you have the cover there and the famous image of the sheath there separating the various races and defining the racial hierarchy for the fascist regime. So in this issue, a quote-unquote portrait of her appeared in order to stoke fears of hybridity and contamination that came from intermixing between Italians and colonial subjects, and to thus ensure a pure white Italian identity for the nation. Therefore, giving Falana the moniker of the Black Venus directly connects her to fascist, racist rhetoric that sought to separate Africans from Italians. In so doing, this naming of Falana designates her as different, thereby allowing moviegoers to view her as a Black body, a commodity, and not as a person. As such, her privileged status is slowly chipped away. Falana's visual representation in the film also falls into this trend of rearticulating or bringing back to the surface racist stereotypes from the colonial period. This is apparent with Falana's first appearance in the film. The first shot of Falana is a close-up of her face with her wearing a large sun hat. The camera then zooms out as Falana walks towards the cabine so she can change into her bathing suit. And in so doing, it shows the reactions of the beachgoers. They all turn to stare at her. And this cinematic presentation of Gli Italiani si voltano, a predatory action, is characterized by John David Rhodes and his analysis of Alberto Lattuada's Gli Italiani si voltano, which was a component of Cesare Zavattini's L'amore in città. And this action includes both men and women here in Stasera mi butto. And it's a visualization of the hegemonic white gaze of the black female body and its sensual appeal, so common in the colonial period's visual representation of African women. And this imperial white male gaze, as Ponzanesi argues, quote, is always bound with power, domination, and eroticization, unquote. As such, the gaze of the beachgoer desubjectivizes and reduces Falana to the exotic other, making her a marketable object of pleasure and denigration. Moreover, since the group staring at Falana includes women, it creates a heterogeneous in regard to gender white gaze that serves to remove her from inclusion in white Italian womanhood and femininity. Now, although Falana in Stasera mi butto enjoyed a privileged status in Italy that reflected her American cultural capital, the examples from the film just discussed show how late 60s visual representations of female blackness that were devoid of openly racist stereotypes still drew on racist ideology and images from Italy's fascist colonial past. In so doing, the fascist racial desire of a pure white Italian identity and the regime's racist and exclusionary rhetoric and policies were reaffirmed and promoted to the Italian public. Now, moving on to another one of Falana's films, you see fascist colonial stereotypes and racial discourse also resurfacing in another post-war Italian film genre in which Falana appeared, the Italian Western. In this period, Italian directors such as Sergio Leone and Sergio Corbucci put their own spin on the American Western film genre, giving the Western a uniquely Italian character. And in creating their own Westerns, Leone, Corbucci, and others created a very popular filone, whereby between 1962 and 1980, close to 500 Italian Westerns were released. And among this output was the 1967 film Lola Falana, Faccia a Faccia con il Diablo, directed by Ciro Marcellini. Now, the film Lola Falana puts two categories typically on the fringes of the Western genre, both American and Italian, though less so for the latter. These categories, gender and race, and puts them at the front and center of the narrative. And these two elements combine to produce the film's protagonist, Lola Gay, played by Falana. Lee Broughton, who has written on African Americans in Italian Westerns, argues that the characters Falana and other African Americans played in the genre were, quote, groundbreaking representations of African Americans out west, unquote, that stood in contrast to how blacks were depicted in American Westerns, if they were depicted at all. For example, Falana brandishes a gun in the film, providing a counterbalance to the more stereotypical sexualized depictions of her that recall the racialized and eroticized characterizations inherent to the figure of the Black Venus. However, in a similar manner to Falana's portrayal in Stasera mi butto, the Black Venus trope remains despite Falana's Americanness. It's not overshadowed by the more progressive depiction. In this respect, Lola Falana aligns with Giovanna Trento's argument that there's a quote-unquote fluidity between Italian Westerns and Italian colonial cinema, with films from the former containing negative and pejorative racial and gender discourses that echoed those contained in the latter. Once again, the existence of a latent fascist racist discourse thus results in the persistence of ideas that stigmatize non-whites and categorize them as others in post-war, post-fascist, and post-colonial Italy. So the film focuses on the town of Sant'Anna, which has been terrorized by El Diablo, played by Herman Cobos, who's the film's antagonist, and he sequestered many of the townspeople in his compound. Falana, plays Lola Gay, as I mentioned, who is a singer-dancer touring the West with her dance troupe. Upon arriving in Sant'Anna, Falana learns of the horrible situation in which the townspeople find themselves, and she takes it upon herself to save them and restore tranquility and prosperity to the town. And it's this decision that allows Falana's characters to, quote, transgress the prescriptive, unquote, race and gender norms in Westerns, and Hollywood films in general becoming a black action heroine in the process, as noted by Broughton. This transgression and Falana's character status as action heroine is apparent in Lola's role as leader of the surprise attack on El Diablo's compound, as Broughton again notes. The transgression comes with Falana wielding a gun, which counters the typical portrait of women in Westerns as, quote, domestic, peaceful counterpoints to men who understand the necessity of violence in the West, unquote. And instead of being the woman who stands for love, forgiveness, and compassion, who argues against the use of violence by her male companion, Falana is the one who encourages the citizens of Santa Ana to stop being acquiescent to El Diablo and fight for their freedom. She subsequently leads the charging townspeople on her horse to his compound, directs one of them to shoot the lookout guard, and shoots one of El Diablo's henchmen herself. With these actions, Falana clearly shows herself to be a proactive, courageous, and daring woman who is not afraid to use violence if need be. In other words, a true action heroine. Now, despite this progressive depiction of Falana, there are more than enough instances in Lola Cult that re-articulate to late 60s Italian cinema goers the racialized rhetoric and stereotypes of the fascist colonial era that separated whites from non-whites, placing the latter on a lower level and excluding them from any sense of belonging to the mainstream. And the main trope that surfaces in the film is that, once again, of the Black Venus. This sexualization of the Black female body inherent to the Black Venus is evident in the film's musical numbers, which feature Falana in skimpy outfits that are a significant contrast to the long dresses and shirt pants outfit, action outfit that she wears in other scenes, as well as the long dresses that all the other women in the film wear. And you'll see a couple stills in a second of that. Furthermore, the director Marcellini includes several uncomfortably long shots of her buttocks and legs in these dance sequences, visually replicating the voyeuristic and sexual gaze of the saloon's primarily male audience. And one interesting thing, too, to bring up about Falana's performances in the saloon is that the townswomen are all on the periphery of the saloon, whereas the men are there more in the seats, like around the dance stage, kind of signaling there's a divide in the space of the saloon as a feminine and then a male space. The fascist discourse against interracial mixing and for racial segregation surfaces toward the beginning of the film when Falana and her dance troupe arrive in Santa Ana searching for medical help for one of the ill dance troupe members. In this instance, Falana's blackness, which is subtly acknowledged, is shown to be problematic, thus preventing her inclusion into the mainstream. In this scene, the townsmen are more than willing to allow Falana and her troupe to stay in the town so the ill woman can recover. Now, of course, it's not completely free hospitality in that Falana has to perform in return. The townswomen, however, refuse to welcome the troupe. After approaching Falana, the head townswoman says, as you can see her there in the upper left-hand corner, she says, "Qui non c'è bisogno di gente come voi." There's no need for people like you here. Abbiamo già abbastanza guai nel paese. We already have enough trouble in this town. When Falana pleads with her, noting the ill woman, the head townswoman responds by saying that the women are malata, nell'anima, they're sick in the soul. Now, while it appears that this rejection is based on the fact that the women are dancers, a profession looked down upon by the morally superior townswomen who represent the petticoat brigade of the traditional American Western, who are supposed to be the enforcer of morality and the town's Puritan conscience. This exclusion can also be read as being due to Falana's skin color, since the camera immediately cuts to a close-up of Falana directly after the woman says, "Qui non c'è bisogno di gente come voi." This camera work therefore implies that the women are being excluded because of Falana's blackness, not because they are dancers. And it's here where we see the polyvalence of Falana. She's a multi-signifier that illustrates the attractive, yet dangerous nature of the Black Venus as represented in the different reactions to Falana which occur along gender lines. Now, Falana's acceptance by men, yet rejection by the women, can be seen as a reference to, and again, a resurfacing of fascist Italy's reactions to interracial sexual relations in the African colonies. In those colonies, Italy's African colonies were noted for the scarce presence of white Italian women, which contributed to making sexual relations between Italian men and African women commonplace. In fact, madamismo, the practice of concubinage in which African women performed the role of so-called comfort wives, became an accepted and even promoted phenomenon. This practice, as noted by Ponzanesi, quote, was not only tolerated, but also encouraged because it was considered to have a stabilizing effect on the political order and colonial health, unquote. So in other words, it was seen as a means of preserving the health of the Italian men, as well as providing a safe way for them to demonstrate their virility by sexually, quote unquote, conquering the perceived to be submissive African female. However, this practice soon became problematic as the relationships resulted in mixed-race children who represented a threat to the Italian race and its pure white identity, as discussed earlier. As such, the fascist government passed the 1937 law mentioned earlier that prohibited these so-called unioni miste. Therefore, taking into consideration this historical fact, the townswomen in the film can be seen as bringing fascist-era disapproval of interracial sexual relations to late 1960s Italian audiences. In so doing, the scene reinforces the idea that Blackness, any degree of it, such as the one-drop rule in the States, has a quote-unquote contaminating effect on Italian national identity, and thus has to be excluded from the national fabric. Therefore, Falana in Lola Cult has a polyvalent function, serving to represent American cultural imperialism through her status as Western action heroine, yet also the presence of a latent fascist racist rhetoric. Now, this resurfacing of racial stereotypes in a racialized construction of Italianness was also present in the print media, which is evident in the press reporting on Falana. The reporting reveals a parallel in regard to the racialized discourse and stereotypes between Falana's representation in her films and in the print media. And in contrast to Lola Cult's implicit confrontation with the issue of interracial sexual relations, the Italian print media explicitly addressed the topic in its reporting on Falana. For example, the magazine Annabella contained an article in its April 27, 1967 issue, featuring the responses of 11 noted Italians, mostly from the cultural realm, to the question which also served as the article's title, as well as the title of my talk this evening, Permettereste a vostro figlio di sposare Lola? Would you allow your son to marry Lola? The responses varied from a full acceptance of the potential interracial union coming from Brunella Gasparini. Non mi importa che un'eventuale nuora sia bianca, rossa, gialla, or nera. It doesn't matter if she's white, red, yellow, or black. To an acceptance on certain conditions coming from Giovanna Fontana. Direi di sì, però dopo solo di aver guardato più che le gambe e il viso di questa ragazza, la sua coscienza. Se la sua coscienza è bianca, il colore della pelle non ha importanza. Per me nulla osta al suo eventuale matrimonio con mio figlio. It's more so her conscience as opposed to her physical appearance is important. To a refusal coming from Diego Fabri, è un'ipotesi che mi procura un certo imbarazzo. Io, francamente, ho un figlio che mi chiedesse una cosa del genere, direi decisamente di no. Non so nemmeno spiegare con precisione i motivi, ma senz'altro no. So, complete no. And also a refusal coming from Cesare Di Angelantonio. L'amore si dice è questione di pelle e non c'è niente da fare. Pelle bianca e pelle nera finiscono con il respingersi reciprocamente. Black skin and white skin don't go together. So this article, which presented a small yet revealing sample of Italian opinions, illustrates a continuity between the fascist and Republican eras in regard to thinking about race and blackness and its place, or really non-place, in Italian society. Another common parallel between Falana's representations in print and visual media, which again illustrates this resurfacing of a racialized discourse and stereotypes from the Italian fascist colonial past, is that of referring to the singer, dancer, and actress as La Venere Nera. Now, paralleling Stasera mi butto's title sequence, the same nickname is applied to Falana in an article, of which you have some shots of on the screen, Lola del Sabato Sera, from the April 16, 1967 issue of Bella. When discussing Falana's presence in Sabato Sera, the television organizers are quoted as saying, quote, "Oggi l'ideale nordico è finito," referring to the Kessler twins. La Venere che va è un Venere marrone con i fianchi semovente e gli occhi neri del sud. The trend now is a brown Venus instead of a Nordic Venus. What is interesting here is the use of the word marrone, brown, instead of nera, black, especially since later in the article, photo caption reads, Lola Falana, la bellissima mulatta, che canta e balla in Sabato Sera. Lola Falana, the beautiful mulatto that sings and dances in Sabato Sera. Here, in this instance, Falana is given a privileged status by the article not applying the designation of black to her. Furthermore, this distinction between black and brown also provides evidence of different understandings of blackness in post-war Italy, in particular that between female American blackness and female African blackness. Yet, in describing how Falana came to be on Sabato Sera, the article states, quote, "Sei mesi dopo a Broadway, Lola diventava una stella." 6 months later on Broadway, she became a star. E così, quando l'autunno scorso il produttore televisione Guido Sacerdote arrivò a New York in cerca di nuove ballerine che potessero fare contorno a Mina, non gli fu difficile vedere in Lola Falana l'ideale nero di Sabato Sera. So when the producer came to New York, the author of the article saying it wasn't difficult for him to see in Lola Falana the ideal black, the quote-unquote ideal black. As evidenced in this article, the interplay between fascist colonial racist rhetoric and an elevation of Falana because of her Americanness, the quote-unquote ideale nero, is present, thereby illustrating the dual components that constituted Falana's representation in the Italian media. And then just to briefly look at how the African-American press discussed Lola Falana. An article from the July 1967 issue of Ebony titled Lola Falana, The World is Her Oyster, provides insight into how the African-American press viewed her, which at times, interestingly, echoed yet contrasted her representation in the Italian press. Now, this article discusses Falana's career in Italy, how she has become a star in the peninsula, and how she hopes that this success will follow her back to the US and make her a household name there. In describing Falana's reception by the Italian press and public, the article summary states, quote, "Unknown to most people in the US, some of Lola's efforts have already paid off in Italy, where earlier this year she captivated millions in a series of TV performances. Immediately, Italian magazines glamorized her as the Black Venus on their covers, and in Rome she was mobbed on the streets." Now, the use of the term Black Venus here in Ebony comes without any commentary on the part of the article's author. In this way, perhaps the author uses it to illustrate the Italian press's and public's fondness of Falana. In line with the sexualized discourse of the Black Venus, this Ebony article and others in the African-American press refer to Falana's quote-unquote sex appeal. Here is just a brief sampling. Quote, "Having talent, beauty, and sex appeal to spare, she is practically assured success," unquote. Another one. Quote, "A headliner in Italy, sexy singer reaches for US stardom," unquote. Another, quote, "Mini-skirted singer upsets Times Square, crowd during stroll through mid-Manhattan, unquote. And then finally, quote, but Lola Falana, a high-strung, hip-swinging hipster with a voice that rings sex appeal and with two of the shapeliest legs in Hollywood, unquote. While Falana is being classified as a sex symbol in the African-American print media, it's in a manner that affirms the dignity and beauty of African-American women. And so doing this representation reflects the Black is Beautiful movement that had come about just prior to Falana's Italian debut. And the Black is Beautiful movement sought to counteract Eurocentric standards of beauty that denigrated and demeaned Black beauty characteristics. And as such, this movement strongly contradicted the image of the Black Venus so prominently in Italian colonialism. So in conclusion, the Italian career of Lola Falana illustrates the intersection of latent fascist, colonial, racist rhetoric and American cultural imperialism in capital and post-war Italy. On one hand, Falana, because of her Americanness, was given a privileged status in respect to other women of African descent who were often viewed solely as bodies in Italian cultural productions of the time. In this respect, an analysis of Falana's Italian career reveals nuances in how Italians understood race and specifically female Blackness in this historical moment. On the other hand, however, this elevation of the singer, dancer, and actress did not equate to the complete erasure of a racialized discourse or the presence of racial stereotypes stemming from fascist colonial policies and ideology when portraying her on screen and reporting on her in the print media. As such, Italy's new constitutional articulation of equality and inclusion, despite Italy's new constitutional articulation of equality and inclusion, fascist racial ideology still continued to permeate Italian cultural productions in the country's post-fascist, democratic, republican iteration. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions, and we quite deliberately envisioned this as a research seminar series and not a lecture series. So in the spirit of the seminar, I hope you'll decide to take part in a conversation and share your thoughts, questions, reflections with our speaker.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. It's really, really engaging and interesting and timely. I have maybe a couple of questions, if it's okay. Firstly, out of curiosity, and you may have already covered this, but I wondered, how did Lola make the move to Italian cinema? What were the specificities of her case? I also wondered to what extent, because we're thinking about the 1960s and an American woman, to what extent Italians kind of kept abreast with developments in the civil rights era. And finally, I was also thinking about whether in the course of your research you've come across any films that are examples of like a critique of colonialism. One example that I think is undecided, maybe not an example, is Amarcord di Fellini. Especially there's a harem scene where there's a large group of women. We don't know which country they're from, but they will sleep with this one very oddball Italian man. I think a lot of people see that film and they're kind of disgusted as the immediate reaction, but then other people have said maybe it's a kind of critical reading. So I was wondering if in your research you'd come along, found examples that were critical. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. Your first question is also a big question mark for me. It's something that has not, in the research I've done on Falana in Italy, it's unclear. It's a big mystery, like how she gets to be in 3 films in 1967 and the television show, because it's all in one year. So there has to be some kind of connections. So as I mentioned, Sammy Davis Jr. was her mentor, that put her in contact with Frank Sinatra. I think she released, if I'm not incorrect, released a single on Frank Sinatra's record label. So I wonder if there's something there. It's like a big missing piece. It's like Falana's here in the States, and then it's a big like mystery on the Atlantic, and then she's in Italy. That's kind of how I see it. And so if anybody ever finds anything, just let me know. It's a big mystery to me. In terms of Italians and civil rights events, from my understanding, the left is really following along with those events and are for that. But again, as I mentioned, drew from Silvana Patriarca's work, even though the left were interested in anti-colonial movements, civil rights movement, she argues that it doesn't mean that they turned back, they reflected and looked at themselves, okay, and to see how they were treating, dealing with the colonial past and with, other marginalized groups in the peninsula, okay. In terms of Italian films and critique of colonialism, not as of yet, and I'm just, initial stages, even though I've been working on Falana for some time now, but I've been looking at the press and not a lot of films focusing mostly on Falana's 3 films and analyzing those and looking at those intersections with African American history and depictions of African American women. I think what's interesting and one thing that Broughton talks about in regards to the Western Lola cult is Lola Falana is bringing this idea in which the image of the black action heroine, which you then see later replicated in the blaxploitation movies of the 70s and those strong female characters. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. I was interested in this Lola cult precisely because of the continuity of the name in the title and the name of the actress or actor, and wondered if you might say a little bit more about that. Is there a blurring of the boundary between the person and the character, etc., and what might that mean? And then a sort of second question is coming from a francophone perspective. And an awareness of the larger-than-life implications of Josephine Baker, and of course her being placed in the Pantheon rather recently by Macron, and him saying such things as "France is Josephine," and really very interesting reappropriation, we might say. There are a lot of different terms we could possibly use for this use of an African-American performer, but who is so much more than that performance, of course, and very symbolic in the French context, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with it, but I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So I'll address the second question first. It's interesting because in the Italian press, Lola Falana will be referred to as the new Josephine Baker, okay? So she looms very large in Italian culture as well, so she's kind of in that tradition too. So there's that connection there. In regard to the first question about Lola Falana and the name Lola cult, it's again, I think, really hinting at that, getting at that question of how does Lola Falana get to Italy? Because it's clear in Stasera mi butto, she plays herself, Lola Falana. In Lola cult, she plays Lola Gay, but it's really Lola Falana. She's just in like Western clothes, and it's taking place in the 19th century instead of the 20th century. She sings and dances. The musical numbers in the films are like pop numbers from the late 60s. They're not, kind of Western type of songs. So it's clear that they're trying to draw on the marketability, growing popularity of Falana at the time. So yeah, I mean, when I watch it, I think of it's Lola Falana as opposed to Lola Gay. And so I think it goes back to that question, how is it, what are the connections, which I haven't found anything. I've came across in, I think it was Ebony, the name of one of her managers, but doing other, searches, Google searches, nothing comes from that. So I don't know if it's through Sinatra or something else to get these connections to bring Falana to Italy.
Yeah.
So this case of study seems to me perfectly relatable to the concept of Orientalism as elaborated by Edward Said. And also you highlighted the generational clash in the acceptance of the trans status, which is related to what Lukács elaborated, for example. So the context is perfectly highlighted, but since we tackled the argument with this aim of intersectionality, I wonder, can we expand the concept of agency and, for example, the awareness of the subject, in this case Lola, and if we have some recounts or...
I think so. I think in the three films, the third one, Quando dico che ti amo, she's one of Tony Remus's many lovers. Okay, what I think is still interesting because it shows that he is potentially in love with a black woman. But the film that shows the most agency, I think, really is Lola Falana, because she is the main protagonist. She is driving all the action in the film. And it really, it's quite a contrast. It's quite something when you think about it, to have this film in 1967 where she is the one saying, come on, townspeople, we're going to go free the other townspeople, and I'm going to lead you all to El Diablo's compound, and she's firing the gun. But you still see behind her, and given the limited time for the talk, there's also another figure, her love interest, Rod, who's played by Peter Martell, and he also he serves as her backup. And he's actually the one, and I'm sorry to give away the ending here, but he's the one who actually ends up killing El Diablo. It's not Falana herself. But another interesting scene in the film is when El Diablo comes on to Falana, and if I recall correctly, it forces a kiss on her. And she clearly says something, I can't remember to the effect, but she clearly pushes him back and says, this isn't gonna happen. So it's clear, so she's asserting some agency here, and she's just, not giving in to El Diablo's evil desires and whims or whatnot. Mm-hmm.
And what about her personal life? Do we have some recounts or?
What I'm looking for, one thing, is how she talks about, the civil rights movement, black freedom struggle that's going on in the States and the Italian press. I haven't come across specific instances, and even, some cases in the articles, the Italian press will be like, oh, how do you like Italy? And she'll, oh, Italians are great. And if they kind of ask her about what's going on in the States, it's very even. It's not, I completely support it, or I don't think it's great. It's like, oh, this is good, but she focuses on me. This is what I'm doing, and I'm just here to, be in Italy and have people like me.
Thank you.
I wanted to continue on this comparative vein of inquiry, because as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think it was so much worse in the United States. I mean, your mention of Sammy Davis brings to mind, all the stories and the tragedy of Sammy Davis in many respects, that, the United States was much more racist, and we had the Constitution and everything else, but it didn't really matter. And am I wrong so I can't imagine a United States Western in the 1960s that would have a black Venus or whatever leading the charge against the Diablo, So does she actually anticipate the black exploitation movies? She's before that.
Yeah, she's before it, so in some ways she does, yeah.
That's a really interesting dynamic, so that's my question is, how, within the context of critical race studies and the context of your work, how does this get cycled back into an evaluation and assessment of the point of departure, which is the United States racial environment. You know, I mean, do you work in that comparative area, or are people doing that?
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting. Like I was saying before, Falana doesn't make like very strong comments about what's going on in the U.S. or how it influenced. She's very moderate. Okay, she's focused more on her career. I think, yeah.
I meant kind of in terms of the general context. I mean, you're saying, okay, Italy was colonial, Italy was fascist, and so they processed this in this way. But it's a global issue, obviously, and so there's all these exchanges. I mean, I guess from a theoretical point of view, a question would be, how do you distinguish between fascism and racism as components in this soup? You know? Yeah. So, because when you were attributing it to fascism, at one point in your analysis, I couldn't, you know, and this is just a question from ignorance, really. You know, how can you measure the persistence of colonial Italy, which was a disaster, and then fascism, and then that's influencing the reception of this case, as opposed to just simple racism, you know, racism as a characteristic of, you know, alterities, whether it's Orientalism or, you know, the encounter with the other in the Italian environment. Do you follow my question?
Yeah, I think so. If I get this correct, just correct me if not. But so you're asking, is it racism and fascism, you're seeing something as kind of separate?
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
I think they are.
Well, I would say racism was part of fascism.
No question. I mean, I'm not.
But in terms of theoretical, but
Yeah, I'm not
how I view things is I look at the particular context, right? So yes, in the US, you have slavery, and that shapes the lives and positionality of African Americans. And it's much more out front, right? Up front, racism in the US, okay, against African Americans. In Italy, how I see it is that even though you don't have racial laws until 1938, even dating back to in the liberal era, you still have these ideas of inferiority and superiority that are infusing the Italian colonial situation. And I think because that's there, it might not be as apparent, as outright as you see in the U.S., but still, it's still there. And I think that's what is the interesting thing here, is that in Italy, it's much more subtle. Okay, it's not going to be in your face like it is in the States. And I think that's why it's very important to look at this, is that it contradicts this narrative of Italiani bravi gente, right? I think that's the thing, is that you see a contrast. They're both there. It's just one is out front, and there's always been movements against it. Okay, going back from when you had the enslaved resisting against their enslavement. And even in Italian colonialism, the defeats of Italians, in the late 19th century. It's there, but I think it's just not, it wasn't as upfront and out. It seemed more like hidden, and it was the norm. And I think also, what Ponzanesi says is not dealing with the colonial past has allowed for that to.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a kind of comment about choices in these films regarding setting, which I think links to Professor Cacci's kind of question, which is, so we see a kind of negation of setting when it comes to the films that we see black women in the Italian canon. From my memory, I remember La ragazza della pelle di luna. It's in the seashells, right? All of these films, if there's ever an Italian director and they're talking about something along this line, it will never be in the territory where it happened. And it makes me think, okay, we have this visceral proximity with slavery in the US, which in my opinion in the UK we don't have that. So we allow ourselves to do something that happens in Italy too, which is we give ourselves like a kind of lexical space from the past. And I see that being perpetuated in films like this and the examples that you chose.
Right. Thank you so much for the insight. I hadn't thought about the settings of the films in that way, so I really appreciate it. And it's interesting, the other Scattini film, La ragazza fuori strada, that actually they start in Egypt and then go to, I think it's Ravenna, if I'm correct. And so that's a really interesting dynamic there, and that she, yeah, it's a distraction, but it's, showing her actually, instead of in some exotic beach locations, showing Zauri Raya in Italian society, yet being pushed out of it.
Thank you. Thank you for your really interesting talk. I was just wondering, you've spoken kind of generally about the representation of Lola and her, and in her characters in these films. I was wondering if you could say something, maybe if you've noticed anything specifically in kind of romantic storylines or romantic things you kind of mentioned briefly before, but considering especially the discussion and these policies on interracial relationships and stuff like that, and the kind of exoticized sexual gaze, towards her that you mentioned. Did she ever get a romantic storyline? You kind of mentioned a bit, and does she have any agency in those? Yeah.
So in Stasera mi butto, she's just merely as the kind of the love connector between Carlo and Marisa. But in Lola Colt, it's interesting because she's involved in a love triangle between Rod and then his girlfriend, Rose, and Rod falls in love with Lola, and they go back and forth, and finally Rod leaves Rose and catches Falana as her stagecoach is leaving Sant'Anna, and he jumps on, and they ride off happily together. But the interesting thing there is that the couple's not staying in Sant'Anna, so they're going out. They're going to an elsewhere to live happily as an interracial couple. So that's my reading of it. But yeah. Okay. And then I'll get yours.
Just real quick, it just kind of, 7 years later, we had Blazing Saddles in the United States, so it's kind of like quite the contrary of, the United States is actively making fun of it, but that's really the realistic version of it, and here's more like the idealistic version of how it possibly could be, but in reality, it's like, it truly is maybe the way America is. I don't know, and maybe there's zero analogy between that, but the first thing I thought about was Blazing Saddles, because it's like a combination of
Blazing Saddles.
Like spaghetti western.
Yeah, no, thank you. I know I have yet to see Blazing Saddles, so unfortunately, I know. I think I'm missing out, I know.
You're going to connect all the dots after.
I know. It would be, the coda to this chapter, this part. But yeah, so no, thank you. Okay.
I didn't watch the movies, and I was wondering if her characters were dubbed or she spoke Italian actress.
She was dubbed. She was dubbed. But it's interesting, in Sabato Sera, Johnny Dorelli was the co-host, and there's a skit of them on the Rai Teke website, and she's speaking in Italian, but it's like completely pidgin Italian, and she goes back and forth between English. It's quite interesting, and she's talking about, all the Italians, and she's saying, how do I say it? And she reverts to English. They turn and stare at me. And then Dorelli looks her up and down and says, io credo, I believe it, lo credo. So it's another one of those instances where it's like, oh yeah, of course, Falana is this great big American celebrity, but yet still we're seeing this kind of subtle, sexualization and treatment of her. So.
Giovanni? Oh,
We have two questions from Zoom. So the first one is from Felicia Guerra. She wants to know, how do you see the representation of blackness you identify in the images of Lola on Italian screens as presented in current Italian cinema? Is there a legacy of seeing blackness as still other, or has this changed?
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I think I've noticed more representations of female blackness in Italian television as opposed to Italian cinema. And then again, me being in the States, television, great thanks to streaming services, is more readily available than films. And so what I've seen in TV shows is, both. It's really both. There are female characters of African descent that are represented as the friends of the best, Italian woman. The protagonist, who is the Italian woman of the show, and with this I'm thinking of a Rai series from 2015. It was called È arrivata la felicità, and she's, just like any other Italian woman. Summertime on Netflix is an example of that. But you also have shows, and this is interesting too because they both deal with crime organizations. So Gomorrah, and then the show whose name escapes me now on Netflix with Rome, Subura. Okay, so in two of their seasons, they had African women who, were sexual objects. One was, what seemed to be, her background was unclear, but there's one scene this is Gomorrah, where her boyfriend is one of the camorristi, and he gives her as a present a Black Panther. Okay, so there's a lot to analyze there. And then in Subura, the character who becomes kind of a quasi-girlfriend with the main character, Aurelio. She is a prostitute. Then Aurelio's sister ends up killing her, and there's a parallel between the sister killing her, and the sister had also killed Aurelio's dog as well earlier on. So there's these interesting links between, and these go back to these stereotypes of relating, people of African descent being more like, animals and animality. So there's an interesting connection there.
Can I go with the second question? Okay. I'm reading from Yuri Brunello, who's saying, my question is if you think it is useful to study the way in which American anti-racist movies have been translated into Italian during the 60s, for example, To Kill a Mockingbird. I have the impression that the study of translations from English into Italian of dialogues, actors' lines, can reserve interesting critical discoveries.
I think that's an excellent point. That's something I haven't looked into yet, but I think that's a great point and is an excellent avenue of analysis to get further insight into the connections between Black America and Italy during this time.
Yes. I'm curious about the connection of Lola with Sabafuseda. And I was wondering if she had any friendship with Mina that grew around that time. There just seemed to be a lot of connections between how the public sort of used their celebrity for just in their exploitation is too strong of a word, but of their womanhood. Even how the first thing you mentioned was referring to her as like an urlatori, like they're just yelling, urlare. And it reminded me of Mina being also a woman who at this time was coming out also with a strong identity, not obviously African American, but as a sort of divorced woman.
Yeah, exactly.
And I didn't know if they had any sort of friendship that evolved.
Nothing that I've seen yet in the press, the Italian press reporting on Falana. It's usually along the lines, when her colleagues of Sabato Serra really love her. You know, she gets along, but nothing like, oh, Mina and Lola have, you know, created a close friendship or anything like that. But it's a really good point, because there's a new book by Rachel Hayworth on Mina that I'm looking to get and to read more into that, considering there's possible parallels and connections between the two. So, of course.
Well, not often, but occasionally would comment on the public's view of her and kind of use of her for what they wanted. I was wondering if Lola ever commented on how the media portrayed her, if there are any interviews of...
Not that I've come across so far. Like I said, in the Italian press, she's very modern, and in the African American press that I've gone through so far, she became a big star in Las Vegas. Okay, like she was making like $2 million a week through her one-woman show. So they talk about, oh, how, you know, great the show is, how big of a celebrity she is, but it's, you know, I haven't really come across anything like, oh, and the media depicted me in this way. But I think also too, you know, which is unfortunate. What happened is that she got MS, you know, in her career, and that really derailed her. And so, you know, I don't think it didn't allow for the kind of that separation and then a reflection back on, this is how I was depicted back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it's more so the stories that I would see of her from the 90s and, you know, in Ebony or Jet is, you know, Lola's coming back, you know, from having MS. She's trying to come back and that kind of thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. I had a question about or I guess I was interested in the way that in the question of Permettereste vostro figlio sposare Lola, the way that both in the responses that question is generating that then get reproduced by the newspaper, and also in the way that we use it, I think very productively as a sort of metonym for approaching the question of the shifting signifiers of race and the fluidity between different productions of race and there is changing over time. I was curious about how that question and the responses to it might be inflected by the question of, I mean, a constituent part of that question being, you know, would you permit your son to marry a movie star? And, you know, the question of a sort of Lola as, and maybe her blackness and her racialization and sexualization being influencing the question, the asking of that question in the first place, and leading to the asking of that question in the first place, and certainly inflecting the responses to it. But to what degree do you think that, or I guess, are there other questions? How might we approach the asking of questions to Italians at that time of, would you permit your son to marry a movie star, and the sort of understanding the way that cinema and the cinema that Lola is in is sort of vehicles of of capital and the influx of capital through surrogate actor bodies. But so I guess that was the first part of my question. The second one being understanding that Lola is and the representations of Lola are producing race and producing a regime of race in Italy, which I think that the way that you were tying it to the sort of lingering and very potent signs of that production of a racial ideology from the Italian colonial period. I appreciated that, but I was wondering what other kinds of productions of race would Italians have been encountering in visual representations at that time, in the way that, in which those continuing, I guess, motifs and stereotypes and signifiers of this racial regime would have been present. I mean, I imagine a focus in the Italian press on civil rights movements in the US, but to what degree were there other representations or productions of race outside of the cinematic in Italy?
For the second question, that's a very good question. I've only looked at film and TV and then how they appear in the print media, so I'm unsure of other aspects, perhaps literature that I don't know. So but that's a good point to take into consideration as I move forward with this project, to see to use as a form of comparison. Especially dealing with African American women, perhaps in other types of cultural productions. In regard to your first question about would your son marry Falana, the question is very open-ended, I think, and I think some of the responses, one of the responses is, I don't care if, she's, what her legs, what she looks like, and that's referring to kind of her as a movie star. So I think, somebody could take it one way, some could take it other. So to me, it seems it was a very open-ended question, but as what the responses you got, but also they all kind of fell along the lines of interracial relations. And I think the current at the time was probably hinting more at that direction, especially given that the magazine that article was in, Annabella, was the second most popular weekly women's magazine in the peninsula. So it's very, popular culture, mainstream, had a lot about film, entertainment stories. So it wasn't, it wasn't a Noi Donne, for example, which was kind of initially against this popular culture, but finds a way to incorporate Italian and American actresses into their magazines to, gain more readership, but still highlight them as good communist movie stars, I guess one could put. So, yeah.
Can I make a joke? Excuse me, but
Of course.
it's would you let your son marry is a very Italian question. I think your question raised that in my mind. I mean, there's a lot of noise around that question, I think, in Italian culture, whether it's a question of a black woman or, any kind of, in other words, it brings into questions of gender in the Italian context, which I think are quite different than what you might find also stateside.
Oh, yeah,
It's a different kind of. But thank you, it was really a wonderful lecture. It was great.
That might be a good place to stop. I believe Jessica.